Alright, so last video we introduced the sort of problem of appeals to authority and the problem, more generally speaking, of we can almost call it sort of the social dimensions of our knowledge, that our knowledge claims sort of frequently seem to come from other people that can't always be trusted. Now we'll go through a series of criteria that we can use to sort of evaluate different kinds of appeals to authority and get a rough sense of how much we can trust some sort of authority claim. So we're going to have a list of about 7 criteria that we're going to use in sort of to evaluate how much or how trustworthy the expert's testimony really is. This is a little bit different from the list of criteria that we had last week when we were looking at the causal arguments. With the causal arguments, it's sort of like a checklist. You go in order, right? Boom, boom, oh, this violates Occam's razor, cross off the hypothetical cause. Not going to be the same thing here. This is going to be something where you're going to have to sort of consider all 7 of these, and there's going to be degrees with which various experts sort of satisfy or fail to satisfy the conditions. So let's just start with the first one. So our first one is that, and the claim being made by the expert has to be in what we're going to call sort of an appropriate domain of knowledge. It's going to be a kind of knowledge that we think expertise is reliable enough to make an appeal to authority work. So there's lots of different kinds of sort of knowledge and expertise, right? So let's just look at some examples. Mathematics. Almost everyone agrees that mathematics is an incredibly reliable discipline, that it's an incredibly certain discipline. It's mostly deductive arguments, in fact. And so as a result of that, when a mathematician says, hey, I solved, the Riemann's hypothesis, if other mathematicians agree, we non-mathematicians are going to take their word for it, right? Because it seems to be an area where expertise is highly possible and where indeed people have attained it. Other areas where people seem to have pretty good confidence is natural science, things like physics and biology. Those are arenas where people seem to be pretty confident that there are indeed real experts and that what they say is in principle trustworthy. It gets a little bit less confident when we start moving to what we call sort of social sciences, things like psychology or sociology. But still, I think there's broad agreement that it is possible to know things in those areas and that what experts say should be listened to. We can keep going down, though, and get to some areas where we start getting a little bit more suspicious. What about art? Are there experts in what count maybe say as good or bad art? And if these experts say, yes, that painting is the best painting ever, should we listen to them just because they say it? There, we're probably a little bit more suspicious. We do indeed think that there are people who have expertise in the field of evaluating art, but we're going to be a little bit less likely just to take their word for it that some painting is good or maybe some movie is good. And then we can go sort of to maybe the bottom, at least the book suggests this is an area where we have no confidence that expertise exists in moral matters. That there are no such things as a moral expert, and so someone saying, hey, trust me, it's wrong to steal because I'm a moral expert, we just would have a tendency, the book argues at least, to reject that kind of claim altogether. Now, I think that is more or less true for, normal American life, but it's actually not true everywhere in the world, and indeed it's probably not even true everywhere in America. In the Islamic world, for example, the imams, the religious leaders, are thought to have a kind of infallible moral authority, at least in some Islamic traditions. So in that case, then, people in those traditions wouldn't sort of agree that there are no such things as moral experts. So I don't want to suggest, we don't need to reach any sort of firm conclusions about this, but it's something you at least need to keep in mind when you're evaluating an expert testimony. Is what the person talking about the kind of thing you even think they really are experts in, or a kind of topic that they're experts about? So the second question you should ask yourself when evaluating expert testimony is, do all experts in the field agree, or at least do the overwhelming majority of them, do most of them? Maybe not, it doesn't need to be necessarily unanimous. I mean, there's not unanimous consensus that antibiotics work to kill bacteria in the medical field. Indeed, it's a high percentage, but it's not universal. So at least is there a very broad consensus in the field about some particular topic. The reason why this is important is if basically what an appeal to authority says is trust me because I'm an expert. But that only works on the assumption that there's nothing special about me such that you're trusting me. You could ask any expert and they would more or less say the same thing that I'm saying right now. So, I'm an expert in ancient philosophy. If I tell you something about the ancient philosopher Plato or Socrates, presumably what I'm telling you should more or less agree with what all other experts in the field would also say about Plato and Socrates. Again, it doesn't have to necessarily be unanimous, right? There's going to be some weird outliers in a lot of cases. But the more settled a question is in a discipline, the more reliable expert testimony is. On the other hand, the less settled the question is, the less reliable it becomes. So if there's a topic, say, in physics that we're not really sure what's causing the expansion of the universe, right, and there's a lot of disagreement, there's a lot of different theories, expert testimony is a lot less reliable on that topic. But almost every physicist agrees that general relativity has been pretty well established, so what physicists would have to say about that topic, general relativity, their expert testimony would carry quite a bit of weight. A lot of the sort of controversies of today really aren't going to be settled by this question. So the global warming case, it's pretty damn high agreement amongst climate scientists that global warming is indeed occurring and that human beings are the cause of it. Last I saw, it was something like 97% of climate scientists thought that was the case. So if you wanted to argue against global warming, you couldn't really do it on this ground. Indeed, the experts seem to agree on the question, or at least the people who we might think are the experts seem to agree on the question. Similarly, the question about whether or not vaccines cause autism, again, it's pretty high that they don't. There just doesn't seem to be any evidence to suggest that they do at the very least, and so there are not very many experts who are in a relevant field to make that claim. That doesn't mean that you have to necessarily accept the appeal, but you can't reject it at least because there's disagreement amongst experts. The third criteria, the third question you should ask yourself is the expert who's speaking an expert sort of in the relevant field that they're actually talking about? I mean, there's all kinds of people who are experts in all kinds of things. I'm an expert in ancient philosophy. But if that doesn't give me any authority to speak about, I don't know, let's say nutrition. I have no greater knowledge of nutrition than probably the average person on the street. So the fact that I'm an expert in one area doesn't mean that I'm an expert in all areas and that my opinion is equally valuable. You see this all the time, right? The book talks about how Nobel scientists or Nobel Award winners get asked questions about things that are kind of completely irrelevant to what they're an expert in. There's no reason to really think that what they have to say is worth more than any other non-expert in the field would be about such topics. Expertise is also something that admits of degree. You can be sort of more or less expert in some topic, and so the more expert you are, obviously, the better. All doctors are some degree, at least, of experts on any medical question. If you have, let's say you're concerned that a mole you have might be cancerous, well, any medical doctor you ask about that will be able to do a far better job than, again, me, not a medical doctor, would be at answering that question. But the more specialized you get in terms of medical practitioners, you'll get more specialized and so therefore more expert answers, right? Someone who specializes in studying cancer could probably answer the question of whether or not the mole is concerning far more trustworthily than a general practitioner could. So you always want sort of the most specialized expert possible. There's also people who are more experts in theoretical questions and people who are more experts in sort of applied or practical questions, application kind of questions. Again, you should sort of prefer the expert who's sort of tailored to whatever the question is. So let's say we want to build a bridge. If I want to build a bridge, the opinions about a physicist who studies in the tensile strengths of rare materials, that indeed will be helpful. But the engineer's expertise in sort of applying that physics to actually making bridges is in that case more relevant, and so the engineer counts as a higher degree of expert. So compared to these first three, the next one is pretty quick, pretty straightforward. Is it the case that the expert has had the chance to sort of seriously think about and analyze all the relevant information about the topic that they're being asked to speak about before they speak? Straightforwardly, the more time you have to think about something, the better what you're going to say is. Same thing's true of the expert. Again, if you asked me a question about Plato, particularly if it's one that I hadn't necessarily thought of before, and I had to answer you right on the spot, I could probably do an okay job. But if you gave me, say, a day to think about it and I could tell you tomorrow, my answer's going to be better just because I had more chance to think about it and to articulate it, right? And it's especially true if it's some new question, maybe something that I wasn't familiar with before. This is something that's especially important in medical contexts because all medical questions are really particular questions, right? So generalized medical knowledge is one thing, but if it's a question about what should I do for my health, that's really heavily based upon my own health situation. A doctor that isn't aware of the particularities of my own situation medically and who hasn't had a chance to study that, their testimony is just really not worth very much because medical advice is so particular to my individual situations. All right, next up, we've got the big one, and the one that probably you've been waiting for this whole time in a certain sense. The next question, is the expert trustworthy, free of bias, and so therefore someone we should trust, or do biases or some sort of conflict of interest mean that we just can't really trust them to be giving us an actual sort of account of the world? You might think back a little bit to the ad hominem fallacies from chapter 4. These ad hominem fallacies are where instead of attacking an argument, you attack the person who makes the argument, right? So, oh, Joe says we should cut taxes, but Joe kicks dogs, so who cares what Joe says? Something like that, right? We sort of don't listen to why Joe thought we should cut the taxes. We just say Joe is not the sort of person who we should listen to. The reason that's normally a fallacy is because it's just better to look at arguments than people. But something is different here in this case of appeal to authority. Remember, the basic structure of an appeal to an authority is believe something is true because the expert says that it's true. That actually makes the sort of qualifications and quality of the expert actually a premise of the argument. Indeed, it's the only premise of the argument. This person is trustworthy, therefore trust them. That's at root. That's what these arguments are sort of suggesting or saying. And so it's actually not committing the ad hominem fallacy, either circumstantial or abusive, to suggest that because of either a conflict of interest or a lack of trustworthiness, some expert's testimony either needs to be rejected outright, or at the very least, a great deal of skepticism needs to be expressed about it. And the reason why is that either a bias or a conflict of interest could potentially call into question why the person is saying what they're saying. In principle, in an appeal to authority, the authorities should be saying what they're saying basically because of their expertise. You want to put it this way, right? If I'm asking a science question, the science should be answering the science question as a scientist, right? And that's the only thing that should be matter is what science says. They should basically just be sort of a vehicle for expressing what science has discovered, or the truths of science. But if someone has a conflict of interest, they might well be saying what they're saying not because of their expertise, but because they want to get paid. Or if someone has a bias, the fear is that they might be saying what they say not because of their expertise, but because of some pre-existing prejudice that's leading them to say it that's not the result of careful study. Now, we've said in the past, and indeed it's well worth emphasizing, it's not the case, really, or it's not the goal that someone have no biases or no conflict of interest. That's not even possible, right? I mean, presumably if you're a scientist studying, again, the climate, you do so because you care about the climate, right? And indeed, that's good. I mean, having an interest, having care, concern for the topic that you're studying is indeed really important, and it's why people go in to become experts in the first place. Similarly, we all need to eat, right? So everyone has some conflict of interest trying to ensure, financial matters, and so you can't find someone who doesn't have a conflict of interest or a bias. What matters is to what extent are those biases or conflict of interests hindering and interfering with the expert testimony that the person is supplying. That's what really matters, and that really can be difficult to tell if you're not yourself an expert in the field. Experts sort of have an advantage. Experts can sort of tell what kind of things does it sound like an expert would say versus what kind of things an expert wouldn't say. Again, I'm a Plato expert, right? Plato and Socrates, those are the two things that I've studied the most. I can just hear someone talk about Plato, even if they disagree with me, actually, and say, oh yeah, this person knows what they're talking about at least, right? Maybe I don't agree with exactly their reading of this particular passage or whatever, but obviously this person is expert, they know what they're saying, right? And then there's other people who talk when I'm like, this person doesn't know what they're saying, right? I can do that because I know a lot about the field. And so I can be a little bit more sensitive to what sounds as if it's coming from some kind of bias or some kind of prejudice rather than, say, from a study of the text. You all, if you're not an expert in the field, you might not be able to rely upon those things. One thing that you can rely on, though, is that frequently, what's a good sign, actually, is if the person who's claiming to be an expert discloses what their biases are and what conflicts of interest they're subject to. This has actually been shown in medical context, so that if a doctor reveals to a patient, hey, just so you know, I have some sort of financial incentive here to order this test. I'm going to make a little bit extra money on it, obviously, but I'm telling you all that. I'm revealing my conflict of interest to you, so you're aware of it. But I still do think the test is necessary. Patients actually find the doctor more trustworthy because of that, because of the disclosure. And I think that makes sense, right? Someone who's sort of revealing to you what their biases are, what conflicts of interest they possess, are sort of demonstrating that they're aware of the problem and that they're concerned with ensuring that what the biases and conflicts of interest they do in fact possess don't hinder their ability to give as much as possible, at least, an impartial assessment of what their expertise tells them about a situation. So this fifth condition is an incredibly important one, and it's an incredibly difficult one. We'll talk a little bit more about this problem in the second video for Chapter 6. Alright, we'll break this up into two halves. So we've looked at the first 5 criteria. We'll look at the last couple and then talk a little bit about overall sort of how we combine these criteria in forming an evaluation of appeals to authority in a follow-up video.